Activism can be truly exhilarating. Many people find deep fulfillment in acting on their convictions or working for causes that they believe in. Some people even have a sense of making history. So there's an emotional high to social movement participation. But there's also a real possibility of getting burned out, of feeling exhausted, because activism can be quite costly. When we think of movement participation, we often think of these high moments where you're engaging in a demonstration or you're participating in a campaign like a sit-in or you're promoting a boycott. But in fact, a lot of activism entails behind-the-scenes work. If you want to get a sense for all the details that can go into a campaign, I would recommend reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Stride Toward Freedom, in which he details all the behind-the-scenes work that was involved in the Montgomery bus boycott. It wasn't just about convincing people to not get on the bus. They had to do many meetings to strategize about how they'd negotiate with the bus companies. They had to do fundraising campaigns. They had to hold rallies to keep people's motivation high. There's a great deal of work that involves long meetings, fundraising, working with the media. And this work is not only time-consuming and costly, but it can, frankly, sometimes be boring. And we also know that there are costs involved in activism. Many people, particularly those who engage in campaigns of civil disobedience, might find that they're going to court or even spend time in prison for their actions. And this type of activism, of course, can place a strain on your personal relationships, particularly if your family and friends, significant others, are not completely supportive of your convictions and your commitment to a movement. So there's a very real possibility that people can burn out and experience a good deal of stress as a result of activism. So the question then is, what can be done? What can be done to avoid burnout, to enable people to continue to persist in a movement and act on their convictions? Fortunately, there have been several studies that look at this question. There was a book came out a number of years ago by Jim Doughton and Paul Ware called The Persistent Activist. And they actually interviewed people who'd managed to sustain their commitment to a movement over long periods of time. And they found some very practical words of advice that can help counter the stresses and costs of activism. One thing, they talked about the fact that as students move into adulthood, they often have new life responsibilities. They may have full-time work, new career possibilities, they have families, and the ones who are able to balance it are often the ones who find a way to accommodate their careers to their activism. So, for instance, some people might decide that they're going to work for a social movement organization so that their activism is actually their career, that's how they're earning their living. We also find that other people simply had a flexible work schedule so that they could take time off to participate in the campaign. We found that the people who persisted are ones who are able to create balance because, like anything, a career, a passionate hobby, these things that take a great deal of time can end up burning you out. And so it's important to balance it with other things in life. But one of the most important things that we've seen, including in my study of the Plowshares movement, is that people who persist over time find a community of like-minded folks. They surround themselves with friends who share their convictions. We tend to have this belief that once you have a deep moral conviction, it stays. But in fact, the intensity of that belief can wane over time. Or if you have countervailing forces, people who are questioning it, it's really important to have a good community of people who can say these values are important, it's worth investing our time and efforts to work towards these goals. So that helps to balance some of the strains on relationships by having relationships that are very supportive. If activists engage in high-risk campaigns, then it's particularly important to find ways to have support. I did a study of Plowshares activists, and this is a group of Catholic left radical activists who take great deal of risks when they break into military facilities to try to damage nuclear weapons to make them inoperable. And they're sentenced to years in prison. And in order to avoid burnout there, what's really essential and what they've built into their movement is a group of people who support them, not only while they're in prison, but commit to helping them find a job or a place to stay when they're released from prison, who commit to helping out with family responsibilities. So building a community, surrounding yourself with like-minded people who reinforce your convictions, finding balance in your work and your activism is essential to avoiding burnout. Now, the other thing that we've learned from previous studies is that people have to find ways to routinely reinforce these convictions to maintain kind of their moral sense of purpose in in a movement. And there are various ways to do this. We know, for example, certain movements have rituals that are designed to reinforce moral convictions. The School of the Americas Watch down in Fort Benning, Georgia, every November has a rally, has a gathering, and it's linked to the date in which several Jesuit priests were killed in El Salvador. And the reason they do this is to remind people, not only to gather people together who share these convictions that this particular school that trains the Latin American military should be shut down, but it's a way to remind them, this is why we're doing it. People's lives are in the balance. These are the people who've been affected. So it's important to have rituals that can reinforce your convictions. The other thing that we've learned from the literature is that you're less likely to burn out if you have kind of the big picture in mind rather than focusing on immediate short-term goals. The reality is you need to focus on short-term goals. And if you look at some of the best movement strategists, they understood this. So if you look, for example, at Martin Luther King Jr., he didn't just say we're going to fight racism, which is a very large, ubiquitous problem. It's historically entrenched. It's built into our institutions and cultural attitudes. It's hard to fight something like that. What he did was he broke it down into one manifestation of racism, segregation. And even from there, he focused it more specifically, targeting the buses in Montgomery, and after that, then the lunch counters. He understood the importance of having short-term victories to keep the momentum going. But at the same time, what we see is if you become too focused on short-term victories, people can easily get discouraged or feel burned out, like we've been working on this campaign and I'm not seeing any results. So you have to balance those short-term victories with a bigger picture. And in fact, in my study of plowshares activists who are very much motivated by their faith, they often talked about the intrinsic value of doing the action, even if they weren't going to see the results in their own lifetime. They believed that doing this action of breaking and damaging nuclear weapons was valuable in and of itself because it was raising awareness about the destructive capacity of weapons. And so seeing action as valuable in itself, rewarding in and of itself, is important because if you're fighting to abolish war, as they are, or trying to abolish weapons of mass destruction, these are long-term struggles, and you have to be able to see the value in what you're doing, not just by real concrete political gains, but valuing the activism in and of itself. So to summarize, there are lots of ways to avoid burnout. Surrounding yourself with a community of like-minded people, developing regular rituals that will reinforce your convictions, getting support, particularly during high-risk campaigns, and changing one's mindset from not just being reliant on short-term gains, but a bigger picture of the value of your activism. Doesn't ensure that people won't burn out, but these are the factors we see in previous studies that help sustain people over time.